This is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Bye-bye Boris. After a turbulent time in British politics, the UK Prime Minister quits as leader of the Conservative Party.
I know that there will be many people who are relieved, and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
Johnson says he will continue to serve as caretaker Prime Minister until the Conservative Party chooses his successor. But the opposition has other ideas.
If they don't get rid of him, then Labour will step up in the national interest and bring a vote of no confidence, because we can't go on with this Prime Minister clinging on for months and months.
Does the change of Prime Minister mean for the UK's policies on Ukraine, Brexit, Northern Ireland and taxation? We'll be assessing what lies ahead.
It was a political exit that became inevitable and a swan song from the British Prime Minister that was extraordinary in its defiance.
Boris Johnson has confirmed he'll leave office after months of intense pressure triggered by a series of scandals. He'd resisted, but colleagues had lined up in the past 24 hours to tell him it was over.
When it came, there was no apology, and he appeared to blame other politicians in his own party for forcing him out. He said he'll serve until a new leader is in place and that the process for choosing his successor would begin. But it is unclear how long that will take and whether he'll be allowed to remain much longer. Our correspondent Catherine Drew reports.
Hi, everybody.
It was a scene familiar to British people. Boris Johnson, the third Conservative Party leader to resign in 5 years.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister.
It followed a hectic few days which saw 5 cabinet ministers and scores of junior ministers and parliamentary aides resign. But Boris Johnson had clung on.
The herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And, my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable.
Johnson's downfall came after a series of scandals that his detractors say showed a lack of integrity and character, including Partygate, lockdown parties in Downing Street during the pandemic, and the appointment of an MP with a known history of sexual misconduct to a senior role. For opposition leaders, the actions of the Conservative Party were welcome but didn't go far enough.
We can't cling on in this way. His own party have finally concluded that he's unfit to be Prime Minister. They can't now inflict him on the country for the next few months.
I do think it is quite incredible, though, to suggest that he will remain as Prime Minister for another 3 to 4 months. I think the sooner he is out of number 10, and preferably that is today, the better.
A leadership contest, which had been brewing in the wings, will now step into gear. Several candidates, including existing cabinet ministers and those that resigned, are expected to try their luck. They want to replace a man genuinely sorry to be leaving the role.
Well, we'll take you to Westminster and our correspondent Catherine Drew in just a moment. First, let's talk to our correspondent Guy Henderson, watching events for us in Downing Street. Guy, Boris Johnson resigned as Prime Minister in a statement that was defined right to the last word.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a long period of silence from Downing Street early on in the day, presumably as the Prime Minister was trying to work out whether there was any way he might be able to avoid this moment. But in the end, the media descended upon Downing Street, the speakers came out came the podium, and eventually the Prime Minister himself to make that statement. Defined in tone, certainly, as you say, almost functional, hardly the tone really of a sort of final farewell speech that you might hear from a leader who was planning on heading out the exit door any moment. No apology for the conduct that has so angered his colleagues, even his senior allies, in their resignation statements in recent days and weeks. He said he did have a regret, but that it was he failed to convince those colleagues that he should be allowed to stay in the job. On Wednesday evening, it was pretty clear that was still his plan. He had said so repeatedly through the day. He had fired Michael Gove, a senior cabinet colleague and an ally who'd met with Mr Johnson and urged him to go earlier on Wednesday. By Thursday morning, another round of resignations. It looked as though that was going to become increasingly difficult for him, including Nadim Sahawi, the replacement Chancellor, had only stepped into the role barely 36 hours before. He'd said in his resignation statement that he did not see this situation as sustainable, and in the end, with that statement, the Prime Minister, up to a point, had to agree with him.
Guy, a number of his colleagues in his own party say that he should go now. Boris Johnson is resisting growing pressure to step down immediately. He wants to remain as caretaker Prime Minister. Can he stay on until the autumn?
It's interesting, he's made a number of new cabinet appointments. They've been trickling in and out of Downing Street. We've seen them through the course of the afternoon, very much sending a message that they want to get on and carry on with government, albeit on an interim basis. The opposition parties are calling for a no-confidence vote if he tries to hang in there. We're even hearing from many Conservative Party figures about their extreme unease at the possibility of this Prime Minister staying on in an interim basis, including from the former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, who said he saw it as unwise for Johnson to remain in this interim role. The concern, I think, particularly amongst his many critics now, is that this is a critical period. There are a number of crises on the economic front, on the security front that this country faces. There are potentially a number of very consequential decisions in those policy spheres. And I think there is a concern that as long as he's in office, or even if one of his close allies were to remain in office on an interim basis, they may still look to try and push through some of that agenda, even though the vast majority of the party now want him out of office.
Guy, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Guy Henderson, in Downing Street.
Well, let's bring in our correspondent, Catherine Drew, who's in Westminster. Catherine, so Boris Johnson has resigned. A new leader will have to be chosen. Talk us through the process. What will that involve?
Well, we should be hearing, and indeed already are, the runners and riders in this, and we are anticipating quite a big field. A lot of people obviously putting out right now. The 1922 committee, which organises this, the Committee of Conservatives, they are debating whether to require the number of backers to increase that number. Last time it was 6, now it may be 15 to 20. Each candidate needs to find 15 to 20 MPs just to whittle down the field. Now, the MPs will vote on these candidates, and until they get down to 2. People will be eliminated in possibly daily votes, get down to 2 candidates, and it is that point when the Conservatives go to their members across the country, about 100,000 of them, and they will get to choose between the 2. There'll be hustings during the summer, and that candidate should be in place by October in time for the Conservative Party conference.
So what kind of person might the Conservative Party be looking for in a new leader?
Well, all of these candidates, no matter who you say, are going to look a little bit pale in comparison to Boris Johnson. He's been such a huge character dominating politics. So anybody basically stood next to him is going to look rather sober, rather serious, probably likely to be a Brexiteer as well. And I think that is what the Conservative Party will be looking for. We've already heard from quite a few of them. Top of the table when you speak to the betting people is Ben Wiss, the Defence Secretary. He's declined to comment on that. His profile has been quite high since the Ukraine conflict. Rishi Sunak, the Treasury Secretary, of course, whose resignation sparked off these very dramatic events, and a handful of others. Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, on her way back to London, and I think we can anticipate her throwing her hat in as well. We've heard from a couple of people. Dominic Raab, Deputy Prime Minister, he's ruling himself out. So obviously there's going to be a lot of runners and riders. These candidates will have to choose how they present themselves. Are they going to be the candidate of continuation, or are they going to represent a change and a fresh start? So a lot to play for. Obviously, we'll hear a lot more about this and the exact timetable to be released next week.
Catherine Drew in Westminster, thank you.
Let's talk to Dr. Andrew Mycock, reader in politics at the University of Huddersfield. Andrew, just give us some context on this, if you would. How significant is this resignation and the manner of this resignation?
I think the significance of the resignation is that if anyone looked back to late 2019 and saw any Prime Minister with an 80-seat majority, it would be stretching most people's imagination to think that within less than 3 years, you would find that Prime Minister to resign by his own party. It's been a remarkable decline in many ways in the political authority of Boris Johnson. Many would argue that it's down to his own personality flaws, but there is a sense that I think that, it really is a unique moment in British politics to see a Prime Minister squander such a significant lead. I think where that leaves British politics is, well, what are the lessons to be learned from the Boris Johnson era? And I think for many, there is a concern that possibly that Boris Johnson's style of leadership, his style of governing the country, drifted into a more presidential territory rather than a more collaborative prime ministerial cabinet-led approach that we're usually used to in the United Kingdom. And that there may be some sense in which there's a need to recalibrate British politics, and it will be likely that the Conservative Party will seek to look for candidates that are not going to be similar in their personality approach to Boris Johnson. And in many ways, maybe his legacy will be is that Britain's experiment with a more populist style leader was a relatively short one.
And was this resignation the story of style? I mean, this resignation was not a dispute about political policy, was it?
In many senses, it was about Boris Johnson's personality, his style of leadership, and particularly his inability at times, apparently, to be able to tell the truth when asked the first time. And I think that over a period of 2.5 years, his party, and particularly his cabinet, became increasingly wary of having to defend their Prime Minister. At the same time, I think that what we've seen, particularly in the last 6 months, has been a slow but certain division within the Conservative Party over policy. Yes, there's a large amount of agreement about getting Brexit done. I think there was support about the way in which Boris Johnson had approached the Ukraine crisis. But I think there was a division growing in the party between those that wanted a small state and a smaller, lower tax take, and those that were more supportive of a more generous, expansive state. And I think that Boris Johnson found himself increasingly struggling to marry and merge those two wings of the party. And I think as we go forward to a leadership election, it'll be interesting to see which candidates support which of those positions in terms of policy as the Conservative Party goes forward.
The newspaper editors will not be getting their headlines ready for tomorrow's newspapers, and people like you will start writing the next politics and history books. What will Boris Johnson's legacy be?
Boris Johnson's legacy will be one where he genuinely shook up British politics. If we go back to his style of leadership as London Mayor, it was very different. We weren't used to that kind of personality-driven form of leadership. And I think particularly his role in the United Kingdom's European Union referendum was instrumental. In many ways, he was the face of Brexit. And not only did he deliver a victory in the Brexit referendum, but he also got Brexit done. And he got it done with a unique style of personality, which often framed himself as being, in many ways, against the establishment, that played to his own unique approach towards politics, which wasn't often serious. At the same time, all of those things came together in many ways to undermine his leadership. And for many, they'll remember a period of British politics which has been defined by chaos and by a sense in which trust in the British political system has slowly but certainly declined. And so, for some, I think there will be a sense of sadness that Boris Johnson's gone. They'll remember him fondly as a politician that said what he was going to do and delivered it. For others, I think there's a sense in which this is a passing of a Prime Minister that was never quite fit for office and proved himself during his period as Prime Minister.
When you teach the politics of international politics in the 2020s, will Trump and Boris be in the same chapter? Are they the same story in many ways?
In some senses, yes. in the fact that they both were outsiders not from a strong political tradition, that they shook up not only the way in which campaigning and the way in which electoral politics was undertaken, but also they changed the parties in which they stood for. And at the same time, I think there's a significant difference between the way in which Donald Trump has approached politics and Boris Johnson has. I think the last few days have really showed the fact that Boris Johnson certainly had a sense in which he had a mandate almost in a presidential sense in terms of the way in which he led the country. But I think that there are certain differences between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, particularly in the nature of his final resignation. Johnson has gone relatively quietly when we compare to the scenes we saw on January the 6th in terms of Donald Trump. So although they may well be mentioned in the same breath, at times I think we're going to be careful not to make sure that we actually think that they're the same style of politician.
Andrew Mycock at the University of Huddersfield, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Boris Johnson has been one of the most vocal supporters of Ukraine. We'll be assessing what his resignation means there.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? There are the cash cows. And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Boris Johnson has been a high-profile supporter of Ukraine, making 2 well-publicised visits to Kyiv and supplying Ukraine with millions of dollars worth of military hardware.
Following his resignation speech, Johnson is reported to have spoken again to President Volodymyr Zelensky by phone.
Well, John Gambrell is the Associated Press correspondent in the Ukrainian city of Lviv. I asked him about the reaction there to Johnson's resignation.
Ukrainian media has been just transfixed today by Boris Johnson's resignation. You have to keep in mind that Johnson was one of the loudest supporters of Ukraine since the Russian invasion in February. Johnson himself has been here twice. He was one of the first Western officials to travel to Kiev, and he was here just last month as well. Now, he has been instrumental in sort of galvanizing this Western support for Ukraine that we've seen, including with its British's longtime ally, the United States of America. One other thing to keep in mind as well is that Johnson has really supported the Ukrainians to the hilt when it comes to their demands for their ability to be able to regain the territory that Russia had seized during this conflict, as well as the earlier Russian invasion in 2014. Now, here in Ukraine, even just at a local gym nearby, they've sort of photoshopped Johnson's head on Zika of a bodybuilder. A lot of people have supported Johnson because of his full-throated response to Russia's invasion of this country. Johnson today, when he stepped down, even wore a British and Ukrainian flag pin on his lapel and said that Ukraine would continue to be supported by the United Kingdom, no matter who the prime minister was.
So what's the latest on the ground in Ukraine? Give us an update.
Well, today we saw Ukrainian forces raise the Ukrainian flag again on Snake Island. You may remember that island. It's the one at the beginning of the war where the Ukrainians had told that Russian warship what to do with itself. Well, Russian forces in the last couple of days had withdrawn after withering fire from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians raised several flags there today. Russia, meanwhile, claims that it struck the island again, but the Ukrainians have not acknowledged that. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Black Sea, Ukraine says that the Russians have launched a missile that struck a Moldovan-flagged oil tanker there that held thousands of liters of fuel oil there. Now, we don't know exactly what's going on. That ship was abandoned at the start of the war by its crew. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the country, we understand that a Russian missile strike has struck central Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine. That killed at least one person and wounded others there. And fighting remains heavy in the east. Now, Russian forces largely, we believe, are taking sort of an operational pause. That's the way that the British military has described it as they try to regroup and rearm their forces. But we anticipate that that means that fighting will continue in the east for the time being.
Boris Johnson's popularity in Ukraine made him extremely unpopular in Russia, where the news of his political demise has been greeted with glee by the Kremlin. He doesn't like us. We don't like him either. That's what Vladimir Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said just before Johnson announced he was going to step down. Our correspondent Stuart Smith is in Moscow, and a reminder that journalists in Russia are working under media laws which restrict what they can report. Stuart, tell us more on Russia's reaction to Boris Johnson's resignation.
Well, UK-Russia politics have been already, before even the so-called special military operation, were already very dire after the UK multiple times has accused Russia of carrying out assassination attempts on its soil. And so it was no surprise that with the announcement of the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson announcing his intention to resign, that with all of the help you've been providing to Kiev, that Russian politicians were not particularly sad about him leaving. As well as the Kremlin, Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia and now Deputy Security Council chairman, said that it was the natural result of British arrogance and incompetent politics. He suggested that the actions of the UK Prime Minister and the need for a resignation might fall to other countries as well. Perhaps Germany and Poland, he suggested, may come next. The chairperson of Russia's upper house says that the UK's actions as the main hawk and Mr. Johnson as the main proponent of Russophobia meant that he had discredited himself in the eyes of British citizens. And the Speaker of the lower house even accused Mr. Johnson of being responsible for the shelling of Russian cities in the Belgorod and Kursk regions because of the UK's commitment to delivering weapons to Ukraine, suggesting that they may have been used by Ukrainian forces to target Russian territory.
Stuart, one of the big stories to talk to you about, the US basketball player on trial over drugs charges in court there today.
That's right, and it wasn't expected that she would, this is Brittany Griner, the American basketball player, it was not expected she would plead guilty today, but indeed that is what's happened in only the second of expected 5 hearings on this trial that was due to last potentially months. So she has now pled guilty. She says that there was no intent in her bringing these 8 cartridges filled with cannabis oil, but that does mean she has been charged with 2 charges here in Russia, one for possession of an illegal substance and one of smuggling an illegal substance. She told the court that she did not want to break the law, and her lawyers said that she was packing in a hurry when leaving the United States for Moscow, and that's why these canisters were in her luggage. It's expected the trial will continue next week when she says she would give a statement to the court as sentencing is expected then. Her lawyers told that reporters present that they are hoping for the most lenient sentence possible. Now, if it was only a drug possession charge, she may have got away with a large fine, but the smuggling charge does mean her minimum sentence, without any additional consideration by the judge for clemency, would be a minimum of 5 years in prison, maximum 10 years in a penal colony. The stakes are high, and that's why the United States is looking to support her throughout this case. The White House Department have said they believe she's wrongfully detained. A US embassy official was present with her in the courtroom earlier today. She said on Grinder's condition that she's eating well, able to read books, and under the circumstances doing very well.
Stuart, thanks for that. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi says a new Cold War must be prevented and peace brokered in Ukraine. His comments came during talks with his Indian counterpart ahead of a meeting of G20 foreign ministers on the Indonesian island of Bali. Wang Yi says unilateral sanctions will exacerbate the Ukraine crisis.
Well, that meeting in Bali will be the first time foreign ministers from some of the world's top economies have come face-to-face with Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov since Russia launched its invasion. Our correspondent Silkina Aluwalia reports.
Peace, stability and growth were the main agenda of the G20 foreign ministers meeting on Thursday. The leaders agree that the global economic condition is very challenging right now, and dealing with the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic is crucial at this moment. In a monumental meeting, Minister Wang Yi also met Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Wang Yi mentioned that important to reintegrate Russian and Ukrainian food exports into global supply chains to help foster economic growth. This is the first time Russia's foreign minister is meeting with high-level leaders since the Russian and Ukraine crisis. Since then, we know that there has been disruptions in the global commodity supply chain, food security issues, and energy crisis in many countries. This is why Wang Yi's meeting with Lavrov is important, because both China and Russia have the power to work together to find sustainable solutions to the major global crisis that is happening right now. In a separate meeting with Indonesia's foreign minister, Wang Yi also discussed the relationship between ASEAN and China and how strengthening this relationship can help to maintain further regional stability. In addition to this, Indonesia also met with Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong, and in that closed meeting, the leaders talked about ways to promote peace in Ukraine and discussed how to reduce the impact of the ongoing conflict in Myanmar. Silkina Aluwalia, CGTN, Bali.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. No love lost. How will the European Union view Boris Johnson's departure, given his central role in Brexit?
What I show of China is what I really experience in China, and it's very different to what people in the West experience in China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
I think it's fantastically important to educate British people about Chinese history and culture.
We have sown seeds which in China have grown to very big trees.
The values of horsemanship, respect, responsibility, compassion can be extended to all relationships.
My name is Max. I'm a food blogger. I grew up in China. Now I live in the UK.
We deserve respect, and the Chinese people with their own culture also deserve respect.
For cross-cultural understanding, I think food is a really good place to start. I hope to spread awareness of all the different cultures within China. I think there's a lot to share.
To increase understanding between cultures, I think time and patience is of course important, but the most important thing is responsibility.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories after a turbulent time in British politics. The UK Prime Minister quits as leader of the Conservative Party.
Boris Johnson says he will continue to serve as caretaker Prime Minister until the Conservative Party chooses his successor.
So it's just over a week since the man Boris Johnson appointed to be his deputy chief whip, in charge of party discipline, Chris Pincher, was accused of groping two men at a social event. Since then, the scandal surrounding what the Prime Minister knew and when he knew it has been growing. But it was a letter on Tuesday morning from a former top civil servant that tipped the balance. The beginning of the end for the Prime Minister came later on Tuesday, with the resignation of his health minister, Sajid Javid. He said he'd lost confidence in Boris Johnson's ability to govern in the national interest. Then, just minutes later, that was followed by arguably the most significant departure, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister, Rishi Sunak. Well, the departure of Javid and Sunak opened the floodgates as resignations started to come in at speed. By the time the Prime Minister arrived for his weekly questioning in Parliament, the number of resignations was well into the 20s. A tough grilling followed as Boris Johnson was picked apart by opposition Labour Party leader Keir Starmer. He criticised the Tory frontbench as a Z-list cast of nodding dogs and urged the Prime Minister to resign. Well, the Prime Minister remained defiant when asked if he had referred to Chris Pincher, the MP suspected of those sexual abuse allegations, as Pincher by name, Pincher by nature, before going on to appoint him as senior government official. When asked would resign, he said his role was to keep going. The next stop for Johnson was the House of Commons Liaison Committee, where he was questioned by another group of MPs of all parties. Among other things, the Prime Minister finally admitted that he had met an ex-KGB agent, Alexander Lebedev, without officials present during his time as Foreign Secretary. With his leadership hanging by a thread, a number of senior ministers urged Boris Johnson to quit. Among them was close confidant Michael Gove. In response, the Prime Minister sacked him. On Wednesday alone, more than 40 ministers and aides quit, a record for a single day. But Downing Street still insisted the Prime Minister was going to fight on. By Thursday morning, that number of resignations was now over 50. Among them, Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis, who said the situation was past the point of no return. Hours later, it was confirmed that Boris Johnson had finally bowed to pressure and would make a statement outside Number 10.
Well, let's talk to Alistair Jones, who's Associate Professor of Politics at De Montfort University. So, a fairly chaotic few days, but does this resignation herald a period of calmer waters for the Conservative Party?
Anything but, in all honesty, because what we're going to have now is a leadership election. So we are going to see a number of the cabinet members who will be vying to be the winner of this election. So there's going to be a lot of infighting going on, a lot of, dare I say, product placement, why somebody is so good, why they should be leader of the party. There will also be backbench MPs who will be doing the same thing. So what we're actually going to see probably throughout the entire summer is a large upheaval in the party. Now, the MPs will eventually whittle the number of candidates down to 2, and those 2 will go around the whole membership of the Conservative Party around the country, trying to garner their votes. So, yeah, it's going to be a little bit traumatic again, just as it was when Boris Johnson defeated Jeremy Hunt way back in 2019.
And what about the opposition Labour Party? Is this a moment of opportunity for them or a moment of danger?
It's a mixture of the two for the Labour Party. On the one hand, they can be presenting themselves as being sensible, stable, dare I say it, the grown-ups of British politics. The downside for them is that the media is going to focus very much upon the Conservative Party, and if the leadership election is civilised and sensible and it's not too much money, the winner of that election will actually have a very, very good, strong media profile and could actually galvanise the party together. If you think back to the time when John Major succeeded Margaret Thatcher, he was able to galvanise the party in such a way that he won the subsequent general election. So that may be the hopes for the Conservatives and the fear for Labour.
And the Labour Party has been calling for elections at this stage. Are we going to have them anytime soon?
No, is the short answer to that one. The next general election is probably going to be December 2024, maybe slightly earlier that year. if the Labour Party call for a vote of no confidence in the government, all Tory MPs will support the government, and thus Boris Johnson can say, hey, look, I've got the support of the party, my government should carry on. Because technically, although he's tendered his resignation, he hasn't actually resigned yet.
Well, as you say, he hasn't resigned yet. It's still unresolved about when he will eventually go. If there does end up being a caretaker Prime Minister, what does that mean for the business of government?
It depends upon who it is. If it's going to be Boris Johnson, he has appointed a whole lot of new people into posts, and it may be that some people who have resigned will be offered their jobs back as part of the caretaker government. The reality is very little is going to change while there's a caretaker government in place. No new big policy proposals will be introduced because that would actually undermine any future leader of the Conservative Party and therefore Conservative Prime Minister.
When it comes to choosing a new leader for the Conservative Party, will there be a bit of an identity crisis for it?
I think there will be, because if you look at the potential candidates who may put their names forward, and some of them already have, the vast majority of the British public are going to go, who's that? And they're not going to know anything about these particular candidates. At least at the last time round, when you had the likes of Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt, people knew who they were. So there's David Davis as well. There were a number of people that were actually known in the public realm. The reality is for most of these people is that the public know very little about them. They'll know some names. They'll know Liz Truss. They'll know Priti Patel. But they're not going to know very much about any of them. And that's going to be a problem for anyone taking over the leadership of the Conservative Party. Is there's an identity crisis. And what is their agenda going to be? How is it going to be different to that of Boris Johnson? So there's a lot of issues that will need to be resolved. And it's going to be very, very difficult for whoever wins.
Alistair Jones from De Montfort University, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
When he was a little boy, Boris Johnson said he wanted to be king of the world, but he couldn't keep what he described as the best job in the world. Boris Johnson's time as British Prime Minister has now come to an end. CGTN's correspondent Naweed Jabarkal looks back on his time in office.
Boris Johnson's rise to the top of British politics has been a bumpy one. It started out pretty conventionally. After a prestigious private education at Eton, he went on to Oxford University and took up several roles in journalism before entering politics. He was twice elected Mayor of London, where his floppy hairstyle and bumbling persona endeared him to some and left him open to ridicule from others. Known simply as Boris, it was in 2016 that he turned his attention to national politics. When the UK voted on whether it wanted to stay in the European Union, many believed Johnson saw an opportunity for advancement and decided to champion the Leave campaign. His antics galvanised the so-called Vote Leave camp, and the country narrowly voted for Brexit to the apparent surprise of Johnson and his allies. Prime Minister David Cameron resigned in defeat. He was appointed Foreign Secretary by Prime Theresa May. 2 years later, and amid allegations of a series of blunders, he resigned in protest at May's position on Brexit. But when May stepped down in mid-2019, his second bid for Downing Street was an easy win. And from the off, Boris Johnson made it clear he would dedicate himself to delivering Brexit, even if it meant crashing out of the EU without a deal. He called for the 2019 December election in an effort to increase his majority. And the gamble paid off. The Conservatives won a sweeping majority, seat after seat in traditional opposition heartlands. Promising to get Brexit done, he delivered the UK's exit from the bloc in January 2020. But his political ambitions were swiftly derailed by coronavirus. His government faced a barrage of criticism for failing to grasp the severity of the outbreak when it first spread across Europe.
I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody.
In the months that followed, criticism of his government's response to COVID grew stronger. The economic damage and unprecedented public support packages led to the worst economic crisis in more than 300 years. But it was an early backer of vaccines. Becoming the first nation to approve a jab, the UK rapidly rolled them out. A political shot in the arm that boosted his ratings. But as has been the case with Johnson throughout the decades, he was unable to shake off controversy. It was accusations of sleaze and poor conduct that dogged his premiership. In one of its most high-profile U-turns, his government scrapped plans to change the body overseeing standards for elected politicians. That was after one of his colleagues was found to have acted improperly by lobbying on behalf of private businesses. Perhaps most controversially of all was what came to be known as Partygate, a series of parties held at his official Downing Street residence over the past 2 years, while the rest of the country was in lockdown and thousands dying from the disease.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise. I know that millions of people across this country have made extraordinary sacrifices over the last 18 months. I know the anguish that they have been through, unable to mourn their relatives, unable to live their lives as they want or to do the things they love. And I know the rage they feel with me and with the government I lead.
Within the space of a few tumultuous years, Johnson rose to the summit of British politics and saw that power fall through his hands. Luigi Barkil, CGTN, London.
Well, news of Boris Johnson's resignation and its consequences is being digested around the world. The outgoing Prime Minister's relationship with the EU was always long and rather tortuous. Our correspondent Ira Spitzer is in Brussels. Ira, as a newspaper journalist and then, of course, later as a politician campaigning for Brexit, Boris Johnson spent years antagonising the EU. What's the feeling about him stepping down? Presumably they're opening the champagne.
Well, I think there are very few tears being shed here in Brussels for the downfall of Boris Johnson, and that is because of the reasons you mentioned, and of course, Brexit. Boris Johnson is more than probably any other person the face of Brexit, and that ended up just being a tortuous, long process that created lots of problems for the European Union. It continues to create lots of work and headaches for people here, so there's a lot of blame, I think, for Boris Johnson's role in that. One of the protagonists in that saga from the European Union side, Michel Barnier, the chief Brexit negotiator at the time, tweeting today that the departure of Boris Johnson opens a new page in relations between the EU and the UK, and saying that he hopes that it's more constructive and more respectful of commitments made. And I think that is really the type of sentiment that we're hearing here. Even after Brexit, the saga continues with the Northern Ireland Protocol and some disagreements about that. Boris Johnson proposing a law which would sort of unilaterally attempt to reopen some of those negotiations about how Northern Ireland is treated within the framework of Brexit in the EU. So that's a big problem. And in fact, another voice that we heard from was Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach Michael Martin. He said that he didn't always agree with Boris Johnson, that relations were especially strained and challenged recently, and that he says now that Johnson is going soon, that he hopes that they can return to the true spirit of partnership. So really some hope now, I think, in lots of Europe that perhaps Brexit and the aftermath of Brexit will be easier to manage without Boris Johnson. But one country where it's a little more complicated, or a lot more complicated, is not an EU member, but an EU candidate state, and that is Ukraine. Ukraine really sees the United Kingdom, and especially Boris Johnson, as an ally in its conflict against Russia, and its president, Vladimir Zelensky, saying in a television interview that Johnson was a true friend to the country and a presidential advisor to Zelensky, tweeting just how grateful he is to Boris Johnson. So the Ukraine issue is something that will perhaps be more complicated now with Boris Johnson's departure, which will have ripple effects also here in Brussels.
Ira, both major UK political parties are committed to Brexit, so regardless of the changing faces, the policy continues. What will the EU be hoping for from a new leader of the UK? Presumably it's simply a change of tone rather than a change of substance.
Well, I think that's accurate. A change of tone would be welcome news here in Brussels, where people really became tired and angry about Boris Johnson's bombastic tone and attitude towards the bloc. But I think there is hope, perhaps not for policy changes or wholesale policy changes, but for issues such as the Northern Ireland Protocol to be resolved with more of a constructive spirit here. And, for example, Irada Garcia Perez, the leader of the Socialist and Democrats parliamentary group, saying that she hopes the next leader will work on building bridges instead of burning them. So that is what European officials are hoping for, I think, from the next British Prime Minister, is a much more stable relationship, and hoping that happens.
Ira, thanks for that. Our correspondent Ira Spitzer in Brussels.
So that's the view from Brussels. But what is the United States making of Boris Johnson's resignation? Let's talk to our correspondent John Terrett in New York. So, John, is the Prime Minister's departure making headlines in the States?
Oh, it certainly is, Jamie and Robin, no doubt about that. We'll get to the serious stuff in just a second, but I thought it might just make you smile to learn that New York One, which is a major cable news channel, it operates in all 5 boroughs here in New York. I caught their headline an hour ago, and it was, "New Yorker resigns as UK Prime Minister." Isn't that absolutely delightful? Well, of course, the reason... Isn't it wonderful? I know, it's fantastic. And the reason that happened, of course, is because Boris Johnson was born here. He was born in the swanky neighbourhood of the Upper East Side, very posh district a number of years ago, of course. As for the other stories around today, well, President Biden's handing out some medals, and as Stuart Smith told us in the programme just now, we've got Brittany Griner in court in Russia today pleading guilty on drugs charges. So those 2 stories are around as well. But Boris is second or third, depending. And I think, with all due respect to Americans, I think that the vast difference that there is between the American political system and the UK parliamentary system is not explained to them nearly often enough. The fact that when Britons go to the polls, they vote for a party, and the parties decide who will lead them. It's not a presidential system like it is here. The fact that Boris Johnson served at the behest of his backbench MPs, and others, of course, but essentially his backbench MPs, and he did that job because they had confidence in him, and it's that confidence that has now run out in the last 48 hours. I think the notion of herd mentality that Mr. Johnson was talking about, I think that will go over the heads of most Americans. I also think it'd be hard for people here to understand how it is that you can resign as party leader but continue as Prime Minister running the country until we are told at least October. And I think that there's a lot being made in the media here of the fact that on this day in which he apparently resigned, he also appointed a new cabinet, held a cabinet meeting and called President Zelensky. But I know that those are issues that are very concerning to Britons as well. Guys?
And John, the relationship between the UK and the US is often called the special relationship. How might a new leader affect transatlantic relations?
Well, that is a very interesting question, Robin, and I will tell you that this special relationship between the White House and Number 10 is a bit more distant in recent years than it has been in the last sort of couple of decades. Started under President Donald Trump, it's continued under President Joe Biden, and I think it's fair to say that Boris and Biden were not busy mates in any way. You know, they weren't particularly friends. They didn't particularly get on, I don't think. And I know that the White House blamed Boris personally for denying the U.S. press corps the chance to question President Biden when the two met back in September of 2021. And I can also tell you the White House is cool on the notion of a U.S.-UK trade deal post-Brexit. But the relationship, having said that, I mean, you don't have to be friends in order to get on, as we all know. And I think it is at least productive, particularly over Ukraine. I think President Biden is very grateful to Boris Johnson for helping to keep this coalition of 36 countries together regarding the special operation in the Ukraine. But there is one other thing which I think is worthy of a mention. And I was listening with great interest to Andrew Mycock from the University of Huddersfield. I think he got it absolutely right. But I will tell you that here in America, there are also comparisons regularly made on television between Boris and Donald Trump, because both men refused to apologize. You heard no apology today outside Number 10 Downing Street. Both men have given the impression of being wrongfully outed from their jobs, and both men have appealed to the millions of voters who still support them rather than the party elites who they would blame for helping to get them out of office. So, you know, I think whoever takes over from Boris Johnson, assuming that, you know, this continues through until early October, is going to have a not a difficult task, but it's going to be a slightly uphill battle, I think, if they want to get back to the point where there was a very super warm relationship between Number 10 and the White House. Guys?
John, thanks very much. Our correspondent, John Terrett in New York.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, bull running is back in Spain, but the controversial event's return hasn't been welcomed by everyone.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. The trial is underway in Italy of the people accused of responsibility for the 2018 Genoa bridge disaster.
43 people died when a bridge carrying a motorway collapsed in the port city. It's one of the biggest criminal trials in Italian history. Our correspondent Alex Fraser reports.
It was one of Italy's worst engineering tragedies. On August 14, 2018, the Morandi Bridge in Genoa collapsed, killing 43 people. Cars dropped 45 metres from the highway to the riverbed and industrial area below. Nearly 4 years later, the process of justice is finally underway. 59 people are standing trial for crimes including manslaughter in what is one of Italy's largest ever court cases. They include the former CEO of Atlantia, which owned the company Autostrada per l'Italia that was responsible for operating the motorway at the time. Prosecutors argue that some of the 59 defendants were aware that there was a risk that the bridge could collapse. But whether they are found guilty or not, the families of those killed that day are concerned that those responsible will not be held to account.
Io penso che il nostro paese si giochi tantissimo in questo processo.
I think there's a lot at stake for Italy in this process, not only with the world watching us, but also for our judicial organisations. If the culprits are not punished and there are no verdicts, it will be difficult for people to continue to have faith in our justice system.
Outside court, relatives of victims of the disaster embraced and prepared to watch proceedings.
Ci sono elementi che attestano che dal 2013 nella documentazione era scritto.
There is evidence that since 2013, documents have said that the bridge was at risk of collapse. In 5 years, nothing was done. This is unacceptable. We, as relatives and civil partners, will fight so that this trial gives justice to our families and respect for the dead who are not here anymore.
E rispetto per I morti che non ci sono più.
A huge number of defendants, lawyers, victims, relatives and journalists are involved in this trial. A marquee has been set up outside court to allow more people to watch proceedings. In the time it has taken for the case to reach court, the new San Giorgio Bridge has been built and opened. Justice will not be as swift. It's expected that the trial could last for more than a year. Alex Fraser, CGTN, Italy.
Air China has restarted direct flights between Beijing and Budapest. It's the latest international route to be re-established between China and the rest of the world after more than 2 years of pandemic restrictions. Our correspondent Giles Gibson reports.
Carriers such as Air China and China Eastern Airlines suspended services in 2020 when countries were locking down to try to control the spread of COVID-19. Hungary's Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó has described the re-establishment of direct flights as a real milestone. Experts here in Budapest also tell us that Asia is a target market when it comes to the country's tourism sector.
The Hungarian Tourist Board has a 2030 plan, and part of that 2030 plan is to refocus on the Far East as opposed to the traditional German-speaking European tourists. So the demographic is changing. Now, unless we have the means of transport in place, there's no way that we can actually focus on that area.
However, China and Hungary have very different approaches when it comes to COVID-19 and travel. For example, if you are coming here from the UK, you don't have to provide any proof of vaccination, you don't have to fill in any special forms, and you don't even have to wear a mask on the flight. In contrast, China has very strict rules for international arrivals. The government did recently, just at the end of last month, cut the quarantine time for international arrivals, but you still have to spend 7 days in an official quarantine centre and then 3 days at home. So travel links that were severed in 2020 in the early stages of the coronavirus pandemic are now being reconnected, but this is also not a return to pre-pandemic days in terms of travel between China and Hungary. Giles Gibson for CGTN, Budapest.
Pamplona Bull Run is back on in Spain after a 2-year break for the pandemic. Over the next week, bulls will chase people through the streets of the Spanish city in a tradition that goes back more than 500 years. But as our correspondent Rahul Pathak reports, not everybody is happy.
It was a sea of red and white. Thousands of corredores in traditional dress packed the main square to celebrate Spain's most famous festival, San Fermín. The pandemic meant this year's edition was the first to be held since 2019. So, appropriately, the official launch was dedicated to all the health workers in Spain. There was big excitement on Thursday morning as the first bull run pounded the streets of the Navarra capital, Pamplona. Every year there are injuries to the runners, but it's still hugely popular. Over 1 million spectators are expected to flood the streets over the 8-day festival. For the runners, there is nothing quite like it.
Es un subidón muy importante, es decir, es una sensación.
You get a huge adrenaline rush. It's a feeling unlike any other. People often ask if you get scared during the race. Of course we get scared, we're terrified, but only up until the race starts. After it starts with the bulls, the feeling changes and is unique. It's one of happiness, joy and love of life.
Es una sensación única en la que hay felicidad.
Now, the fiesta was immortalised by the writer Ernest Hemingway in his book The Sun Also Rises, and as such it attracts tourists from all over the world, with 40% of all the runners coming from overseas. But not everyone agrees. Animal rights protesters made their voices heard earlier this week. They believe this event and bullfighting are nothing more than animal cruelty and should be banned. International animal protection groups have highlighted examples of bulls dying from the effects of extreme stress caused by crowds and the noise of the event. However, those that support the festival see it as a fundamental part of their culture and ultimately how they see themselves.
La corrida y la fiesta.
The race and the celebrations that surround it, it's the game between life and death. It's what represents the Mediterranean and Spanish way to celebrate life. It demonstrates how we relate with death, and it shows how much we love nature by facing it.
16 people have lost their lives over the last century. Thankfully, no one has suffered the same fate in the first race this year. And after a 3-year absence, there seems to be an overwhelming sense of celebration. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
The headlines again. After a turbulent time in British politics, the UK Prime Minister quits as leader of the Conservative Party.
Boris Johnson says he will continue to serve as caretaker Prime Minister until the Conservative Party chooses his successor.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.